Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Starting Small. Today, I'm joined by Katie Beal Brown of Lone River Beverage Co. Katie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course, I'd like to start out with your upbringing. Where did you grow up, and what would you say your childhood was like?
So I grew up in a small town in West Texas. Have you ever been to Texas before?
A couple times, yeah. Mhm.
So West Texas is a pretty remote part of Texas. I'm sure you probably didn't venture out that way. There's not much
No.
out there. But my family actually settled in the area over 100 years ago. So my roots
Wow.
run pretty deep in West Texas. And my family has a working ranch in far West Texas, which, if you can imagine, is even more remote than West Texas. I think it's about 3 hours to the nearest airport. So I really grew up kind of, in that small town community, but also our family spent a ton of time out on our family ranch. And that's really kind of been like the foundation of a lot of our family milestones and moments and memories. And that's where I spent a ton of time with my grandparents as well. And
Mm,
a lot of the things that they instilled in me as a child came from my time out there with them. And just a lot of the lessons we learned and really
yeah.
understanding what it means to have a work ethic and really roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty.
Mm,
And so that's kind of, where I grew up, small town, remote part of the country, but really strong community and definitely a very distinct way of life out there.
mm. For sure. I'm curious, growing up with that family heritage and on the ranch, like, what was your aspirations of growing up, and were you interested in sports, or what did you aspire to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's really ironic now because I basically spent my whole childhood trying to find ways to get out of our small town. And I always thought like I meant for bigger things. I remember the first time my grandmother took me to New York City. I was just blown away by like the size and scale of the city and the energy and all of the different kind of like businesses there. And
Mm,
I just always felt like I'm destined for bigger things than this small town that I'm stuck in.
yeah.
Um, and the irony of it all is, the business that I started in Lone River Beverage Company actually took me back to that small town and really celebrating the roots and the way that I grew up. And I think the more time that I spent away from that small town, the more I realized like how much it made me who I am
Mm,
and how unique and special it was to grow up that way. And the values that it instilled with me that I really carried throughout every part of my life.
mm, for sure. So I'm curious, what were your grade school years like, especially leading into college as well? Um, what did you study going into college, and what was that time like?
Yeah, so I think when I think back on growing up, so my family has a family business that's been run for several generations,
Hmm.
but my dad was always had this very entrepreneurial spirit, even though he went to work in our family business.
Hmm.
And he always had like little projects and things that he was tinkering with, and that always was very attractive to me and something that I kind of just grew up around and almost like aspired to like having these little projects and hobbies and passions myself.
Yeah.
And I think from a very young age, I don't know, I assume it's because like seeing my dad and how he operated that way, but I always had these like very big dreams and goals. And, some of them didn't make a lot of sense, but I always was kind of aspiring to something. And
Yeah.
an example I'll give you, so I actually in kindergarten decided that I wanted to get in the Guinness Book of World Records. And so I convinced my entire kindergarten class to try to make the longest paper chain in history, which we didn't quite get there. But I think for me, like the exciting part of it and what I've always been driven by is more just the process of trying to achieve something that almost seems like a little bit out of reach.
Yeah.
And how much I grow and learn from that. And so I think back to a lot of those different moments and goals and things and how that's led me to the journey that I'm on today and
For sure.
how I get so much fulfillment out of the process of trying to get there, and it's almost even more rewarding to me than actually accomplishing the thing that I thought that I wanted to accomplish, because a lot of
Yeah.
times I haven't achieved those goals to the extent that I thought that I would, but it's taken me down a path that's led me to something else. And I think that's kind of the beauty of having that kind of mindset, which I since have learned is called a growth mindset. And
Yeah.
learning that terminology has really unlocked a lot for me just in thinking about whenever I get stuck in life or in business, like I always try to put myself in a position where I have to learn something new.
Mm,
And that just opens my mind up to the possibility of what I can do, the possibility of what, you know, I might be able to create. And
yeah.
so even if it's a small skill that has nothing to do with what I'm doing at the time, I always find it to be just, very freeing to get into the process of learning again and trying to challenge myself to do something new.
Hmm. Incredible. I love that. And going into also school and specifically college, what did you get into when you were in college? Did you get into any clubs, and what was that like? You had a lot of aspirations and ambitions. I'm curious.
Yeah, so I think when I was in high school, I thought I wanted to go to art school.
Mm,
I was very passionate about art, and I thought I might want to do something in design. I wasn't quite sure what that would look like. And at the last minute before I decided, so I applied to a lot of the art schools throughout the US. And at the last minute, I kind of decided like, I don't know if I actually want to put myself in that down that specific path of only doing art. Like, what if I want to change my mind and explore something else? And I ended up going to Southern Methodist University in Texas
mhm.
instead. But I started out studying art there. And then over time, I actually decided to get into this new major that they created the year that I was a freshman called Markets and Culture.
Mm,
And it really was kind of a mix of anthropology, sociology, and business. And so it brought a lot of these things together that I was just naturally interested in.
yeah.
Um, but it didn't have like this set career path attached to it. I mean, it was a new major. It wasn't like, if I tell people my major, even now, was markets and culture, people are like, oh, okay, so marketing. I'm like, well, not really.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, and I ended up um having a double major in studio art as well. So I guess to be totally honest, like my life and my career path, it hasn't been a straight line. I've
Mm,
always kind of followed my passions and interests. And somehow that has led me to a journey where looking at all those pieces and all those steps, it has started to make sense. But there has
yeah.
been a lot of times when I felt like, what am I doing? What am I going to do? I don't know. Like it wasn't like I went to school and said I want to be a lawyer and
Yeah.
had this like destined path that I always knew I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a very long
No, for
answer.
sure. I'm curious then, once you got that degree specifically, I'm curious, the listeners are curious, but, what did you end up doing? I look at your resume, looked at your LinkedIn, I see the journey that you took. Can you explain kind of after college what you ended up doing?
So I graduated during a major recession, and
Yeah.
it basically was like, get any job you can get because they're few and far between. And I ended up taking an unpaid internship as kind of my first job out the gates. And it was in a kind of it was like more of a creative outlet around the fashion industry. But it
Mm,
was just this crazy experience because I was working like, 12 to 16-hour days. I wasn't getting paid a dime, but
yeah.
I just felt really motivated to like get out there in the workforce in some way and start to prove myself that I could, like rise to the occasion, even in an industry that I knew nothing about.
Yeah.
So, and it's funny now because I feel like the days of the unpaid internship don't really exist anymore, but
Yeah.
I think this like, it gave me the mentality of any job I had after that. Like, I felt very grateful to be there. And
For
I
sure.
never took that for granted, even if, there were jobs that I wasn't that excited about, or over time I felt like I wanted to do something else. I still was so grateful just to have an income and an opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, I think sometimes like with these next generations, without having that foundation of working so hard to even get your first job, like it just, you
Yeah.
don't have the same kind of gratitude when you're approaching everything. And I think you're just kind of set up for disappointment in a
Yeah.
way.
No, I totally agree,
Uh,
and I strongly personally advocate for, unpaid internships. I took one out of or
yeah.
during school as well, and I remember just cold emailing specific
Yes.
places I wanted to be, the position I wanted to be in, and because of unpaid and the sole reason of no return expected other than experience, led to greater opportunities. So I strongly advocate for that as well.
it gives you like a different kind of hustle, I think,
Yeah.
when you have to start that way. But yeah, so I mean, that's where I started. And then I, over time, I went to work at a startup. They had a really interesting technology they were trying to bring to the market. And then by way of that, I actually landed down a career path of working in advertising,
Mm,
which ended up being a really good fit for me. And I wish I had figured it out much earlier. Because in advertising, you get to learn a lot about different businesses and different industries and the challenges that they have and how they're communicating with their consumers. And so I think it really helped me like hone some of those entrepreneurial skills because I was
mm,
looking at a lot of different types of businesses and trying to understand how they work and how they can be more successful.
mm,
Um, and I think also just understanding like how they're finding ways to communicate with their consumer in a way that's really resonant.
mm.
So that then was really fun to kind of land in advertising and feel like, okay, actually, this might be like the career I was meant to do.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, it was, it again, it wasn't a straight line. I took the circuitous route there. I wish I had majored in it. I would have had way more of a foundational knowledge of what I was doing, but I was always a person that was happy to start and work from the ground up. And I
Yeah.
was like the first person to get there, last person to leave. That's just how I've approached every job. I may not be the smartest person in the room, but I'm always going to work the
Mm,
hardest.
I love that. I would love to hear what kind of industries did you focus on when you were in your advertising? I'm sure it was a variety, but what would you say you specialized in that time period personally?
I mean, the fun part about advertising is you really get to do a little bit of everything. I mean, I
Yeah.
worked on a lot of different kinds of brands and industries. I worked in cars, in food and beverage, in
Mm,
CPG, in pharmaceuticals. I mean, and there's so many nuances to a lot of these industries and the products and the different
mm.
conglomerates that own them. So I actually, that to me was the best part. I don't think I ever really wanted to like specialize in a specific industry or type of client because
Yeah.
I actually got a lot of like energy and inspiration around just learning about something new. Like at one point, one of my clients, I worked on a couple of different brands for Hershey.
Okay.
Um, so Reese's, Hershey, like classic candy brands, and
Wow.
I just was so interested in like the history of how it all came about. I read like a book of the Hershey history, and that kind
Mm,
of gave me like it allowed me to sink my teeth into more of what we were doing and how it's evolved into today and how consumers think about candy and sugar and all of that.
mm.
And so again, like I'm just kind of giving you like an
I
example
love it.
these are the things that in advertising, like I found to be really exciting. And I liked to just like go really deep on these clients and
Mhm.
really understand like the genesis of their business, but then also like what are the challenges they're facing today and how can
Yeah.
advertising help solve that?
Mm, incredible. I'd like to hear, how does then Lone River Beverage Company come out of here? You're in advertising for a few years. You mentioned you worked in CPG with some clients.
Yep.
Did that have a huge inspiration on this launch? And what was that? If you can explain.
So I started my career in advertising in Texas. And then after I got married, my husband actually got a job in New York. So we had the
Mm,
chance to live in New York. We were young and we were kind of at the beginning of our careers. And when we got there, he basically said to me, like, you have a month to find a job or we're gonna run out of money. So I went out and basically took any interview I could in any industry. Again, like ended up at with the opportunity to work at one of the best advertising agencies in the world, but
mm,
had to start from the ground up. And
yeah.
I think more so my experience living in New York really like I think helped me get to the point of formulating this idea, then working in advertising gave me the tools to do it.
Yeah.
Living in New York and being so far from home, I mean, I grew up in a small town. This was a really big transition for me.
For
Um,
sure.
I think that really shaped like how I got to the idea because when I was there, when I would tell people where I grew up or where I came from, a lot of people had no frame of reference. This small town in Texas where it's from, like what the culture is like there.
Mm,
And so I started to find little references and things that I could pull into the conversation to give them more context into like who I am and where I come from and
mm,
cocktail called ranch water
Yep.
actually kind of became like my party trick to be able to tell people more about where I come from. So ranch water is a cocktail. It's traditionally made with tequila, soda, lime, and it's actually been a bar call out in far west Texas since the 1960s.
Mm.
But more than a drink, there's actually a legend behind it. So in West Texas, it's said that it was originally concocted by a wild-haired rancher who, after drinking it, followed miles of Texas stars until he fell asleep under a pinon tree. And this
Wow.
wild-haired rancher, the place that he concocted it is actually the same spot as my family's ranch.
Wow.
So I always felt like really connected to that story and the drink, and telling people like what a ranch water was. I would find them then like wanting to tell their friends like, oh, let's get a ranch water. And um it just started to kind of get traction in my social circles up there. And
Mm.
so I started to see the emergence of hard seltzer, and it just felt like there was never a brand for me in that category. And it felt like a sea of sameness, skinny cans, fruity flavors. There wasn't something that I loved the idea of a seltzer, and
Yeah.
a lot of the kind of like markers of it and benefits, that it's lighter, gluten-free, like all those kinds of things. But
Mm.
there wasn't a brand that I really could connect with. And so that's where it started to percolate in my head of, what if we took this cocktail from West Texas and put it in a can and made it a hard seltzer, but really use this as an opportunity to tell the story of where ranch water comes from and the culture that it represents in far West Texas. And
Mm.
what I learned in the process is that, while I thought about that culture as like, this is a small place on the map where I come from,
Yep.
it's actually a culture that was resonant with way more people across the US than I ever expected, because I think it's really emblematic of like the American West and
For
what
sure.
people think of that. Um, and so that's something that I think like it's helped us evolve into over time, like
Mm.
taking it out of just like this comes from West Texas to like this actually represents the Western lifestyle in a way.
Yeah. I would love to hear those early days of you deciding that you actually want to launch this drink. What did that prototyping process look like? The design, the tasting. What did you look for when you wanted to formulate the drink? Kind of those early stages for you.
Yeah, so I think in the early days, the hardest part is you don't really know where to start.
Yeah.
So I just tried to be like a sponge of information and talk to anybody that I could that had any connection to how the alcohol industry, any brands in the alcohol industry, any manufacturers in the alcohol industry. So each of those conversations kind of gave me like a nugget of information that then would carry me into the next step.
Mm.
Um, but really, because of my background in advertising, like the part that felt most natural for me to really start on was starting to bring the brand to life and what that looked like and what that stood for.
Yeah.
So that was something, while I was working in my 9 to 5 job, I was kind of on the side, like I would work with some designers that I knew to say, like, this is my vision and how I think it can come to life. And we would tweak it and kind of evolve it, just in our free time, just to say, like, okay, if we brought this to life, this is what it could look like.
Mm.
Uh, and then once that started to really take shape, we had gotten enough of that, like enough of those connections from all those little conversations, to get into somebody that could actually help us create the liquid in a way that would be able to be mass produced and
Mm.
shelf stable and all of those things that you need to create a product that goes
Yeah.
into a store. So those two things, they started to kind of come together. And, I think there was a point a couple months into that where we felt like, okay, we have a liquid that's great, and I think this could really work. And then we have a brand that feels like what we want it to represent. And
Mm.
so that's when I think it really started to feel real. And, we realized like, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to have, because everything to that point, I would just siphon off like a little bit of our own personal money to put into it.
Yeah.
But at that, once we had the liquid and the packaging and all of that, I was like, okay, we need real capital to go out and make this happen.
Mm.
So I think that was like a really pivotal moment at that
Totally.
point.
Totally. So you mentioned capital. Did you end up doing a raise at the beginning for production, and what did that look like? If you can
Yes.
share.
We did. So we in the alcohol business, you can't actually sell your product directly into a store yourself. You have to have a distributor.
Yeah.
So we went and we actually pitched it to a distributor. And it was one of the biggest Bush distributors in the country. And when they
Wow.
said yes, we were like, okay, it's go time. Like we have to go fund a full production run and get this out into the market.
Mm,
That's when, coming out of that meeting, we went out and we immediately started to raise money. And we started with, a small group of friends and family that then kind of extended out a little beyond that. But our first fundraise was really all just friends and family or friends of friends,
mhm.
kind of putting in what they could. And so that's what funded and jump started the real business part of it in our first production run.
Amazing. I'd love to hear then, how that went. Was it a specific retailer that you went into, or what was that?
Yeah, so once we knew we could fund that production run and we had our distributor in place, we went and we pitched the biggest retailer in Texas.
Mhm.
And this was December 2019, and we actually learned that they were going to put us on shelf in all their stores in Texas, but we had to have the product delivered by April 1st.
Mm,
So it was then like, okay, we have to sprint to April 1st to get this all ready to go and
yeah.
all the things we need to go to market. Um, and like, nothing was going to stop us. However, as we all know, as we got into March, the global pandemic started to unfold.
Yeah.
And so everything you can possibly imagine that could go wrong went wrong in our supply
Mm,
chain. And it was just a constant like bob and weave of trying to get, things connected and this here and that there, and problem solving. And by the grace of God, our product got to the retailer by April 1st. And I think
wow.
that really changed the fate of our business. If we had missed that
Yeah.
window, I'm not sure we would have experienced the kind of, early traction that we did.
Mm. Um, it's hard to gauge because you guys just got into retail at that time, but I'm curious, what kind of impact did COVID especially have going forward for the business in that maybe that first year? Did it affect
Yeah.
supply chain going forward, logistics? What was that like?
So I remember our distributor. So for our first order, they were saying to us as the pandemic was unfolding, they're like, listen, we don't know what's going to happen. It seems like consumers are really gravitating to brands they're familiar with, but we're going to give it a shot. We're going to take a small order.
Yeah.
And I think they ordered a couple thousand cases. And so they took the product, it started to get out on shelf. I remember calling. So the first ever store that went into, I called the store and I was like, do you have Lone River Ranch water? Like, has anybody come in to buy it? And they're like, we're
Yeah.
already sold. And so that was a moment where I was like, okay, like I think we might be on to something. So very quickly, within weeks of that order dropping, we were sold out of all of our inventory, and our distributor was asking us to double, triple, quadruple our orders.
Wow.
And so that then, we started to put all of our energy into scaling up our supply chain and really getting more sophisticated because at that time there was a global aluminum can shortage. And so we had
Yeah.
to get very creative in terms of like how we were sourcing cans and getting them to the right places and expanding our capacity. And
Mm,
so, but we knew that like this was a really critical moment of growth for us.
yeah.
So if we could just get our product to shelf, it would make a world of difference. And it was worth like the extra expense. It was worth
Mm.
the extra hours.
Yeah, what would you grant that demand to? And especially the early stages, what marketing did you guys do? And then you can also kind of describe what works for you guys today, because beverages specifically are gauged towards taste and marketing typically. So what worked for you guys?
Um, Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of in the beer business, especially, like a lot of the tried and true ways of introducing a new product to the market are sampling. So
Yeah.
just, getting liquid to lips, getting the product in people's hands. And that tactic was completely taken off the table during COVID.
Yeah.
Obviously, stores were very limited. There were no samplings happening anywhere. So we had already planned to take really, and I think this kind of connects to your background,
Mhm.
take a digital first approach to like how we were marketing our product. And we invested really heavily out the gates in social media, doing like a performance based media approach there that
Mhm.
is similar to how a lot of DTC see brands operate in terms of how they're using social media advertising.
Yeah,
And we were just taking tons and tons of assets and seeing what was resonating most with the consumers. And then our investment would kind of funnel its way into those, assets that were working the hardest for
for
us.
sure.
And then we were driving them to what we called like our most valuable action, which was actually getting people to our website, to our store locator. Because at the time when you're scaling up distribution, like one of the biggest challenges is you're driving this awareness, but then you have to really help the consumer and hold their hand
Yeah,
so that they can figure out where they can even buy it.
for sure.
And so getting them to that store locator was like, the kind of like the golden ticket for us to just even get the consumer there. And that's what a
Yeah,
lot of our performance-based, social advertising was really like contingent around.
yeah,
So yeah, so I think that was and that was, the bulk of our investment from a marketing perspective from the beginning. And social, I think beyond that, like organically became a very powerful platform for us, just
yeah,
in allowing us to have like that one-on-one connection with our consumer. A lot of the people that we connected with, like that were some of our first consumers, we now like know their families, we see them in person all the time, like they become real friends. And
mm,
um, I think that was a big difference for me from working in advertising to having a brand that I owned and really could control a lot
yeah,
of the process around. Is the consumers, like, and the people that were willing to put their money up to buy our product was such, and still is, like the ultimate point of pride.
yeah,
Us, like we wanted to know them, we wanted to thank them, like that is why our business exists.
for
And
sure.
I think sometimes when you are more disconnected from the consumer and working in a process, maybe at an agency or at a bigger company, like you forget that these consumers are real people.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that it's something that I hope we never kind of lose that touch in our
mm,
business, no matter what our scale is.
yeah. Taking some of that feedback from that marketing, what would you say is the main demographic for Lone River from the early days, and did that shift and change at all going forward?
I mean, it's really, I would say the biggest shift for us has been the geographic
Mm,
evolution. So when we first launched, we launched only in Texas and Tennessee. We're
yeah,
now a nationwide brand. So by way of that, it's definitely expanded. Um, it's definitely expanded like the consumer base and the demographic that we have
yep,
beyond those geographies. But I think there's like a certain psychographic that really connects all of the consumers, no matter where they are.
mm,
Um, because I think like our brand, we never wanted to just put a product on the shelf. We wanted to create like a brand that people could connect to that represents a lifestyle.
yeah,
And I think because it represents that lifestyle, there's a bigger piece of it that people can connect to. And that's why I think there's a lot of similarities in those psychographics. So there's people, in the Pacific Northwest
yeah,
might be able to like understand and resonate with this lifestyle just as much as somebody in like a small town that lives on a ranch in
mm,
West Texas.
for sure. I'd like to taking some of the kind of these past couple years that you guys have been in retail, has direct to consumer ever been in thought? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, we always went, well, especially in the early days, we really wanted to do direct to consumer
Yeah.
because we had so many people outside of Texas and Tennessee that wanted to buy the product but couldn't.
Mm,
However, the regulatory considerations in the alcohol business, it was too much
yeah,
for us to take on in conjunction with all the disruption that happened during the pandemic.
for sure.
So it was something that, our small team just couldn't manage,
Yeah.
like everything else that we were trying to navigate at the time.
No, that makes sense for sure. Well, Katie, I like to conclude each episode with this. If you can share one piece of advice with an aspiring entrepreneur, maybe something you've learned or regret along the way, what would that be?
Um, I think just to go back to the earlier part of our conversation
Mhm.
is just the importance of saying yes.
Mm,
Always finding a way to say yes. It's so much easier to say no.
yeah,
And I think, there's definitely, as your business grows and pressure increases, it's very easy to say no when you're very aware of the risk involved.
Mm,
But, I think saying yes gets you to a place where you're operating with a growth mindset.
mm,
And as a small business, growth is more important than anything else.
mm,
Um, so I think it's just always finding a way to say yes, even if
for
it's
sure.
not the yes that maybe somebody wanted, like find a way to say yes to what they're asking, but maybe in a way that feels a little bit more comfortable for
Mm,
you.
for sure. Amazing. Well, Katie, thank you so much for joining me. And to the listeners out there, make sure to check out Lone River at loneriverbevco.com.